Araby opens with the narrator, an unnamed boy, describing North Richmond Street. North Richmond is a blind street, also known as a dead-end street, which means that the road is only accessible from one side. The exterior of the houses on North Richmond are described as being brown and sombre, but containing decent lives within, except, that is, for the empty two-story house at the blind end. The young narrator reflects that North Richmond is a quiet street for the majority of the day. The only exception is the hour after the Christian Brothers' school ends, and the boys are sent home. The boys take over North Richmond on their way home from school and transform the sleepy street into their own personal playground. For that brief hour, the street becomes their domain. The narrator thinks about his home's previous tenant while reflecting on his childhood street. He recalls that his home used to be the residence of a priest who died in the back drawing room. The priest was a charitable man who, upon his death, donated all of his money to various institutions and all of his furniture to his sister. 3 damp books, The Abbot, The Devout Communicant, and the Memoirs of Vidocq, from the waste room behind the kitchen and a rusty bicycle pump next to the apple tree in the backyard, are the only traces of the priest that the narrator was able to find. Our young narrator also reflects on the games that he and his friends like to play. He explains that he and his friends like to run about on North Richmond Street, both in the road and in the backyards of various houses, no matter the weather. The narrator recalls how all the boys on North Richmond Street play outside even in the dead of winter and do not come inside until their bodies practically glow from the cold. Much of their play involves spying on and, when necessary, dodging the older members of their community. The narrator and his friends run through various backyards and hide in the shadows when they reach the street again, hoping to avoid people in the neighborhood, especially the narrator's uncle. However, while the narrator goes out of his way to avoid most of the older people on North Richmond Street, he's always keen to gaze at his friend Mangan's sister. Mangan's sister often comes to the front of their house to call her brother to tea while the boys are playing, a moment that the narrator savors. He is mesmerized by the girl and gazes, enraptured, at the way the glow from the doorway illuminates her figure, and the way her dress, body and hair swing from side to side as she moves through the yard. The narrator is enamored with Mangan's sister, and his infatuation only continues to grow. Every morning, he lies on the floor by the window in the front room of his house so that he can see when she walks out her front door. He rushes outside and proceeds to follow her as soon as she departs. The narrator is too charmed and too afraid to actually communicate with the girl. Instead of walking with her or making any contact, he walks a few paces behind her until their contradicting journeys force him to pass her. The narrator and Mangan's sister interact very little, but she is always in his thoughts. He explains that this is the case even when he is in places that are hostile to romance, such as crowded streets filled with intoxicated men and women who are loudly attempting to sell their wares. Even the most basic and unromantic task can trigger a daydream about Mangan's sister. For example, the narrator wanders in a daze while food shopping with his aunt at a busy marketplace on a Saturday evening. The narrator is unable to focus among the packed and noisy stalls and is only able to think about the romanticized object of his desire. He is so moved by the strength of his passions and so tortured that he cannot make himself interact with Mangan's sister that he often finds himself on the verge of tears. One rainy evening, the sheer magnitude of his desire is so consuming that he sequesters himself alone in the back room of his house and murmurs, "Oh love," to himself in the darkness. The narrator's infatuation is clearly intense, but he fears that he will never gather the courage to speak with the girl and express his feelings. However, one morning, Mangan's sister addresses the narrator directly and asks him if he plans to go to Araby, a Dublin bazaar. She laments that she cannot go because her school is having a retreat that week. The narrator is so stunned that his love is speaking to him, and so caught off guard by the interaction that he cannot even remember if he answers yes or no to her innocent question. Having recovered from the initial shock of the conversation, the narrator seizes on the opportunity to ingratiate himself to the girl and offers to bring her back something from the bazaar since she cannot attend herself. He immediately asks his aunt for permission to go to Araby. She is surprised by his request but says that he can attend that Saturday night. The narrator is overcome with eager, restless waiting and fidgety tension in anticipation of the bazaar. He cannot focus in school, much to the frustration of his instructors, because he finds the lessons tedious as they distract him from thinking about Mangan's sister and the gifts that he might buy her to obtain her favor. On the morning of the bazaar, the narrator reminds his uncle that he plans to attend the event so that the uncle will return home early and provide the train fare. He then trudges to school, eager for the day to be over so that he can head to the bazaar. Unfortunately, dinner passes and a guest visits, but the narrator's uncle does not return despite the reminder that morning. The narrator impatiently endures the time passing, wandering from room to room and singing to himself as a distraction. He stands at the window and sees his friends playing in the street, but his sour mood and nervous disposition cause him to simply watch the merriment from the window instead of joining in himself. Instead, he gazes at Mangan's house for an hour and imagines Mangan's sister leaning on the fence, just like she did when she asked him if he was planning on going to Araby. Finally, the narrator's uncle walks through the front door at 9 p.m., several hours after he was supposed to be back. The uncle is unbothered and unapologetic that he has forgotten about the narrator's plans to go to the bazaar. The uncle attempts to joke with his nephew by reciting the epigram, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," while he hands over the money, but the narrator is too frustrated to even smile. The uncle then asks him if he knows the poem "The Arab's Farewell to His Steed," but the narrator manages to leave just as his uncle begins to recite the lines and makes a hurried dash for the train station despite the late hour. Thanks to eternally slow trains, the narrator arrives at the bazaar just before 10 p.m., when it is starting to close down. Undeterred, he approaches one stall that is still open and looks at its contents. While perusing porcelain vases and floral tea sets, the narrator eavesdrops on the young woman watching over the stall as she flirts with two older customers and remarks that all three of them have English accents. The young woman asks him if he wishes to make a purchase, but the narrator derives from her tone and demeanor that she is addressing him out of obligation as opposed to friendly interest. The narrator's excitement to be at Araby soon gives way to discomfort and apprehension because the young woman makes him feel unwanted and childish. As a result, the narrator does not buy anything. With no purchase for Mangan's sister, the narrator stands angrily in the deserted bazaar as the lights go out.